there are things that we ourselves haven't done quite right, which also doesn't help in terms of our credit rating and the rest of them. And then, so if you look at it, this is from the UN work that was done. If you look at the average cost at which Germany borrows from the same market that Africa borrows from, Germany does so on the average at 1.5%, US is 3.1%, Asia 6.6%, but Africa does so at 11.6%, right? So the continent that is poor, that needs cheaper capital for development spending is rather paying more relative to the advanced countries. And I agree with those who propose that there's a need for us to restructure the global financial system and make it more just and fairer so that we all can participate from that. But the other interesting thing as we go along is for us to soon realize that it's Africa's own money that is lent back to us at these higher costs. Okay, at this higher cost, because more than 60% of Africa's high net worth individuals actually don't keep their money on this continent. Okay, so we make the money here with political, economy, influence, and all of that. The money leaves the continent, goes back to those countries, lent back to us at a higher cost, and then we are always paying the price for it. And yesterday, we had several propositions along this line in terms of how much we spend on our debt servicing and how that is crowding now development spending or priority spending. Without doing something fundamental about this, Africa will only talk about development, and our development would exist in the literature or in the textbooks. So if you look at the debt slavery, if you look at how much leaves the continent in terms of debt servicing, it runs into billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. And if you compare that to our development spending, you can understand why we are unable to build infrastructure, social spending, in terms of spending on education, health, and then social protection is very weak because how much we spend on our debt is quite high. This is also closely linked to Africa's tax system. So we have been advised and encouraged with our own support over the decades to design a tax system that gives comfort to lenders. Gives comfort to lenders. So we have to demonstrate our tax capacity to be able to service our debt so that we can take on more debt. In the process, we have actually impoverished ourselves through higher tax rates. And Africa has one of the highest tax rates in the world, right? And then again, because if you look at the tax structure as well, when it comes to corporate income tax, we have designed a system in such a way that it favors foreign capital. Okay, it favors foreign capital because a lot of the big businesses are coming from there and all of that. Meanwhile, whilst we are weak and inefficient in terms of corporate income tax, we are being pushed aggressively to rake in more tax revenue through indirect tax handles. Indirect tax handles that affect the poor more and the vulnerable. So if you look at VAT, Africa has one of the highest VAT rates. Of course, in Eastern Europe, VAT rate could be very high because income levels are very high. But then if you look at the kind of VAT system we are operating here, it actually worsens inequality, right? So a lot of African countries have VAT rate as high as 20%, okay? Even though the IMF is saying that the VAT rate in excess of 18%, an additional increase only makes...
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, sir, but there's no table here to take notes and you're making some valuable input. Are we going to get this email to us, your presentation?
Yes.
Something like a video of this, so we can also get that.
Thank you, thank you. On my part, I can assure you the slides will be made available. Thank you. It's now the property of this organization, the conference, so that will be made available. Thank you. Okay, so we do this structure, servicing our debt, billions of dollars exiting the continent. And I agree with those who are saying that our external debt should be serviced in a local currency. Because sometimes our debt servicing itself fuels exchange rate volatility. right? So, because our generation capacity is in a local currency, our debt servicing obligation in a foreign currency, and anytime we have to meet our debt obligations, our currency suffers at the end of the day. So, those are some of the things that we want to take into consideration. All right, so Africa borrows, but Africa is not poor. Okay, Africa is not poor. When you are traveling back to Africa, you see the number of expatriates and all of them who come here. I mean, there's something here, that's why they are coming. If you look at what leaves the continent, and here is not new, we are all familiar with this. If you look at what exits the continent in terms of illicit financial flows and all of that, relative to what comes in by way of debt, foreign direct investment, and portfolio flows, our conclusion, similar to other authors, is that Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world. So it means that if we'll be able to deal with illicit financial flows and preserve resources here, we could actually end up lending to the rest of the world. And it's the reason I started my presentation by saying that Africa is probably the only continent where water flows upwards. So if you are down there, the water will not come to you. And again, the economic nature that we have designed is such that there is greater upward redistribution of wealth. So we have recorded positive growth in the last couple of decades, but the growth doesn't benefit ordinary Africans. So it benefits just a tiny few, and the rest of them actually leaves the continent. And you can also understand it from this perspective. If you pick factors of production, if you pick land, Africa has land, but increasingly a large portion of our land are no longer going to be in the hands of Africans. Have you noticed that? Okay, there's land grabbing going on the continent. The other factor of production is what we call labor. Africa supplies labor. The reward on labor is very cheap. Okay, the reward on labor is very cheap. Africa is not saving. And because Africa is not saving, Africa is unable to finance its own development. And the capital comes from outside the continent, and the return on the capital is very high. So if you look at return on capital as a factor of production, and you compare that to return on labor, also as a factor of production, return on capital is very high, which goes to outside the country because the capital is coming from outside. And return on labor is very low because we provide the what? The labor. And yesterday, somebody was sharing her perspective from South Africa, the mining, those who work in the mining and the rest of them. The wage bill they command is as small as could be described. So fast forward, Africa has great needs, especially in the area of climate change. So we need financing. We contribute so less to climate change, and yet we bear the brunt of it. And simply because our economic model still relies on the traditional weather-dependent and the rest of them. So climate change affects us the more. But if you look at flows to us over the years, we have not gotten enough compensation for climate change we contribute so less to, and yet we bear the brunt of it. And some of these inequalities also affect us. My time is almost up. Yes, in our analysis as well, we realized that colonization has left an entrenched and worsened effect on women empowerment, and then also loss of political influence, of course, based on the patriarchal system that was operated. Also, of course, we had been doing that before, but it was just exacerbated by colonization. Thank you. This is the end of it's a summary of the presentation. I'm sure you'll get a copy of the paper itself and the slides as well, and the conversation will continue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. And so this was a draft version. I can assure you the real black paper is coming, and we will invite you for the actual grand opening and launching of that. Thank you so much. I don't know how you managed to do that in the amount of time you did. That has to be an academic feat. It reminded me as I was listening to Sylvia Tamale, one of my favorite authors, thinkers on decolonization. She's Ugandan. And she says decolonizing is a tall order. It requires us to smash the pot and return to the river for fresh clay to mold a new pot. It requires recentering, rehumanizing, reconstructing, and resisting. The goal for African decolonization and the decolonial project is about one thing: the restoration of dignity to the African people. And I think that's something that we have to center and something that the Prof has really brought to the fore. Right, so we're now going to move to discussants and reactions to the paper and contributions from Eunice. I will ask Eunice to come up, and as she comes up, Eunice Ofei is a researcher in public policy whose work focuses on climate finance and development in Africa. She examines how global climate finance flows influence poverty and inequality, and how policy frameworks can be designed to promote fairer and more sustainable outcomes. Her research interests lie at the intersection of climate justice, governance, and economic transformation, with a commitment to exploring approaches that place equity and resilience at the center of development policy. Welcome, Eunice.
Hi, everybody, and good morning to you all. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. So, just a few comments on the black paper that Prof has presented very interestingly from the climate finance perspective. He mentioned it briefly in the presentation, but there's much more information in the paper that will be shared with everyone as has been promised, and then we'll get to read that. So I believe that the paper has made it clear that Africa's fiscal space is already constrained by the debt and also the illicit financial flows, and this affects climate action significantly, and because if a significant portion of our national resources or our national revenues, are directed towards servicing external debt, which is contracted also at very high rates, as Prof mentioned, then little is left for basic needs, education, health, among others, social protection, and again, importantly, climate action. So at this time, the same time, the illicit financial flows are siphoning off billions annually that could otherwise be invested in much needed climate action on the continent. Climate finance does limited absorptive capacity. So I'd like to point out, while I would like to talk about two issues. Structure or architecture. It's not different from the global financial architecture we've been talking about all through this conference, and how it is designed against Africa, and that is seen also very clearly in the climate finance architecture. So from a public policy perspective, the two issues I want to talk about is the first one is something that has been mentioned here even yesterday a couple of times, that first, the climate finance, most of the climate finance, a significant portion, around 70% of climate finance flowing to Africa is in the form of loans, which is making worse the already existing debt problem that we have in Africa. So rather than easing the debt burdens, it is adding to them. Then the second issue is the fact that because of the dependency, which is also mentioned in the paper, or the dependency on external approval or donor-driven project frameworks, the climate finance tends to be fragmented and misaligned with local priorities. So it tends to come in from designed by external bodies, mostly from the global north, with little regard for domestic policy priorities. And this, rather than helping reduce the problems that the climate crisis has caused, is rather reinforcing these inequalities they are supposedly helping alleviate. So to me, the challenge is twofold: restructuring the global rules to make climate finance truly reparative, while at the same time strengthening governance here, back at home, and at the national levels and on the continent, to ensure that finance, once secured, is equitably distributed, or as Prof says, the water gets down, flows downwards, and gets to the people on the ground. So without tackling both sides, we risk reinforcing the very resource bleeding that this campaign seeks to stop. So what do we need? We need policy frameworks that are rooted in climate justice and equity. And I want to mention that, so at the global level, first of all, we need climate finance that is genuinely reparative and just. What does that mean? By that I mean that the climate finance is not charity, but it is compensation for the disproportionate burden that Africa carries, despite contributing the least to the climate crisis. And so then reparations must become part of the climate finance dialogue. So the way that we frame the reparations is important. If it is seen as charity, it will fail. If it is seen as help, you help someone when you want to or when you have. So I'll give you money when I can. But if it is seen as an obligation, then if it's framed as a legal and moral obligation, then it can shift the discourse and help in enforcing just and reparative climate finance. Then also at the national level, we must build transparent and accountable institutions. Because again, as Prof noted, if the finance is coming into a system where the money leaving the continent is significantly higher than how much we even get by way of climate finance to deal with the projects, then when the money comes in, it will go right out through the leakages that are in the financial system, which I believe is working against each other. That means we are still bleeding, and the bleeding is not being stopped. So at the global level, we want financial systems, the climate finance, to be just and reparative, not charity or even aid. Now, at the national level, again, the challenge is that how do we make sure that these funds are being distributed equitably and transparently? Again, how is the water getting down to those at the bottom? One thing that I would like to highlight is, again, also mentioned in the paper, that gender must be central to these things. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate shocks through the loss of lives, food insecurity, or displacement, yet they are often excluded from decision-making on resource allocation. If we want them to benefit, we have to ensure gender-responsive budgeting that supports women-led enterprises in climate adaptation and investing in social infrastructure. Then the funds coming in must be predictable and long-term flows that allow the African governments to not to plan for the finance that are coming in and not just crumble from one project cycle to the next. Again, one suggestion that I would like to make is that if Africa is going to be strong on the global level, then we have to be strong internally. We have to strengthen our regional integration and present a strong front on the global stage so that we can better argue or make strong points for why we deserve better, why the systems must change, and why they must work together for Africa. So then, I want to make the point as I close, and then give my time is up, right? Yes. The way forward must be twofold. We must not forget that. While we fight for global reparations and justice, we must also fight domestically for accountability and inclusion, because without tackling both, climate finance risks becoming another channel through which Africa bleeds rather than heals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eunice. I had dinner with a group of amazing women last night, so it also took me a bit to wake up this morning. And part of the conversation was somebody overheard a conversation, and I'm trying not to look at the person who overheard the conversation, about how, climate conversations is not really a useful use of time in this space. Climate really isn't our issue on this continent. And I think, Eunice, thank you. You really point out that it is our issue. It's a reparative demand. It's not a favor. Yes, we do emit less than 4% of climate emissions, but we bear a huge burden of what's happening. So thank you. And as we were having that conversation, part of the conversation, and thank you to Afrodad and the team, is that there's a significantly increased representation of women, and especially young women and Afrodad. So that's been such a joy to watch and experience, and the intersectionality of that has been so amazing to see over the last few years. And so talking about amazing women, I am now going to introduce Ms. Chinai Mukumba. who is the dynamic executive director at the Tax Justice Network Africa, based in Nairobi, Kenya, although she's Zimbabwean, but we've adopted her. She provides strategic leadership across TGNA's diverse thematic areas, driving the organization's mission and vision. With a master's degree in international relations from WITS and taxation from the University of Oxford, Chennai brings a formidable academic background to her role. As a prominent female voice, we're particularly proud to have such an accomplished young woman at the helm of Africa's premier tax organization, leading in a field often dominated by established male figures. I say young with a caveat. Space young is anything 40 and up, and maybe we need to begin to change that. But I welcome Chennai. I won't take any more time because I sent her the questions, so I won't repeat it, but welcome.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I consider myself young, but I think this space has interesting definitions when it comes to age. Thank you so much, Aphrodad, I think, for creating this platform and giving us an opportunity to speak on, I think, as Professor Bobkin just mentioned, this paper that we, as the Stop the Bleeding campaign, want to use as the basis for work moving forward. As was mentioned, this paper is entitled The Black Paper, and really this is a pushback against the normal papers that are often referred to as white papers. We want to reclaim the space, this language, and really give it a Pan-African identity. So what I was asked to speak on was really about some of the systemic and structural reform that we're starting to see within the global financial architecture space. One of the points that was raised earlier in the presentation was that one of the issues we need to seriously consider tackling as a continent is the scourge of illicit financial flows, because this is particularly significantly affecting the way in which we interact within the global financial architecture, and also contributing to the current debt burden that we see ourselves confronted with as a continent. One of the things that I often say whenever I'm asked to speak about illicit financial flows is that for me it is such a frustrating conversation, because the estimates that we currently have in terms of how much we're losing, and these are very conservative estimates, right, put us at losing around $90 billion. But when you think about how much we are receiving, both in foreign direct investment as well as overseas development assistance, to borrow the words of Professor, the water really is flowing upwards, because we receive in foreign direct investment $54 billion, which means we're losing double the amount of money that we go around begging for, right, to invest within the continent. In terms of overseas development, these figures are estimated to be about $40 billion. Again, most of you will recall the amount of outcry we had when USAID essentially decided to close their taps. But when you compare that, again, to the amount of money that we lose as a continent, it's really minuscule. So for me, one of the things that I often say is that people talk about this continent being rich in mineral wealth, being rich in resources, having a young population. But even before that, quite frankly, we are also rich in financial resources. At some point, all of these resources actually exist on the continent, but then they're finding themselves funneled out. So even before we have conversations about increasing tax rates or expanding the tax base, we at one point or the other have these resources on the continent. And so we need to be having a meaningful conversation about how do we retain those resources. And the discussion on the reform of the global financial architecture is such an important piece. So I've been asked to speak a little bit about what's happening within the global financial architecture that's being spearheaded by the tax justice movement. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes really speaking to that. One of the things that we've been discussing over the past few days, for those of you who are also here for the sort of young scholars sort of session that Aphrodad and Ideas was having, is this concept that when we talk about reparations, yes, it is about fixing the historical injustices, but over and above that, it's also about correcting the systemic and structural conditions that continue to perpetuate inequality and injustice today. And so right now, what's happening and what's being led by the tax justice movement is this conversation about reforming the global tax system, because embedded within the rules that underpin that are systems that continue to perpetuate inequality between states, but also between peoples. So when you think about the current body that governs the global tax system, and this is really borrowing for those of you who heard Dereje's remarks yesterday, it's currently being overseen by the OECD. Now, the OECD took over this role in the 1960s, and in the 1960s, many of our countries at that point were really just fighting for political independence, right? And so since the 1960s, this group of rich countries has dominated global tax conversations. And as you can imagine, we have currently, therefore, a global tax system that is skewed in favor of the countries that were at the table, right, when these rules were being made. Also, the countries that continue to make these rules are the same countries that got together in the 1960s to do this work. So in 2020, there was what at that point felt like a really small development, but Nigeria tabled a proposal for the UN to start having conversations on how to promote an effective and inclusive international tax system. So at the time, there wasn't really much thought about it, so the paper passed and was adopted as Resolution 77-244. But what this resolution did was begin the first ever conversation that includes every single country on how to think through the global tax system. Now, the reason this is so important is because, and I completely agree with Eunice, there are so many conversations we need to have about what we need to reform domestically, right, to address the loss of resources that we have. But we also need to be thinking about how you reform the global tax system, how you reform the global financial architecture. Often as civil society, we are almost reprimanded for being lofty, right, and not thinking through sort of practical solutions, right, when thinking about structural reform, etc. But this particular conversation that's happening at the UN is exactly that. It's an example of how you can have a conversation about systemic and structural reform that has very, very practical ways of doing that. So over the past few years, there's been conversations where different countries are coming together with regards to how do we reform this global tax system? What are some of the measures that need to be put in place to make it more equitable, to make it more fair? So right now, I remember, not right now, but a few years ago, I remember sitting in one of those conversations before the negotiations had actually begun. And I remember within that conversation, it was the Deputy Commissioner General of Lesotho who raised his flag right at the beginning of the discussions. And one of the things he said is that, you know, I never thought that as a country, I would have the ability to contribute to these discussions, knowing that my vote would count as much as anybody's, right? Regardless of the size of my economy, right? And literally, we have seen that playing throughout the negotiations over the past few years. What was particularly significant was that at the beginning of this year, when they were talking through what is this framework convention going to look like? What are these protocols going to exist? In the afternoon of the first day, the United States raised their flag and said, you know, in light of current discussions internally, we're no longer going to be participating in these conversations because they don't align with our national interest. And they walked out. You know what happened? Nothing. The conversations continued because within that platform, every single country that's sitting in those negotiations has one vote, regardless of your size, regardless of how much weight you have within the global financial architecture. And so I point to this as an example because whilst the conversation, of course, is getting more technical and there's various contributions that need to come from various stakeholders, it really, for me, provides an example of the kind of reform that is possible when we all come together. I didn't mention this, but the group of countries that is spearheading this change is the Africa group, the most unexpected group to be pushing forward this type of conversation within the United Nations. And there's so much pushback, significant pushback, but having worked with some of these negotiators, they are committed to see how they can actually contribute to what we talk about all the time in conversations like this. And I think what's incredible is that it's almost started the snowball effect, because similarly, there is another conversation that's also on the cusp of beginning with regards to how can we have this type of discussion within the debt movement. And so AfroDad is working with colleagues within the negotiation space to push something like that forward. So for us, as part of the Stop the Bleeding campaign, we're so excited to be engaged in conversations like this, where we're actually able to practicalize the conversations that are happening within this room. And so I think for me, really it's to say there is movement that's happening. There really is an opportunity that is presenting itself for us to genuinely influence these global conversations, even as we are looking internally with regards to domestic reforms as well. And it's incredibly exciting. And so I invite all of you to join us as we do this work to literally stop the bleeding of the resources that are leaving our continent. Thank you.
Thanks, Janai. What did I say about brilliance? Thanks, Janai, and reminding us that somebody said yesterday that Americans say you can run and chew gum. In Kenya, we say we can walk and chew gum. We take things slower and more intentionally. We can do multiverses of things all at the same time, and I think it's important to remember that. I'm looking at Jason to see if we're going to be kicked out of here anytime soon, but I'd like to open up for a round of 3 questions, reactions. And before I start, I'm going to shamelessly plug us at NAWI. We work on both theoretical analysis, but also colloquial manifestations of analysis. And one of the things, I'll come to you, one of the things that we've worked on is a little 101 on economics. And so I'll read the last bit. We will have them for distribution later. And it talks about, it talks about the economy through the language of life, is what we call it, rather than simplification. We don't want to be one of those people who just talk about how bad things are, talking about how to get free. It certainly is possible to live different, to have economic policies that work for the people and the land. We don't have to be the characters in the scary movie who keep going the wrong way. This does not have to be our destiny. So what can we do? This part is not necessarily like the movies where the bad person has to be killed or where there's one thing or person to overcome. It's more complicated than that because, like we said before, the system changed us. Also, the people who created and run the system are some mean mothers. Still, some things we can do. Recognize that it's absurd. Know that it doesn't have to be. Imagine a different way. Make it make sense. Listen to market women. Listen to the workers. Push our governments to restructure borrowing and debt in our favor. Push them to fund healthcare, to fund education, and to fund the farmers, because they can, because poverty is created. Center life, eat in communion, share what you have, recognize when enough is enough. Grow the food, take care of the soil, watch the bloom, harvest the goods. And then, when we get it going, when we leave it all behind, shelve this little pocketbook as a relic from another time. So I hope that inspires us to keep going. And also sometimes it's not that complicated, right? Centering ourselves, making sure that we're all living in dignity, that people are fed, people are healthy, and that we're rebalancing power dynamics, and that we're resisting this ideation that Tandika Mukindawire talked about, the Africa failure complex, that we can believe that we're able. So I'll open up for a round of 3 questions. I'm going to gender balance it. The lady at the back, I'll have the gentleman here, Jason, and then the gentleman on that side. If you can have microphones.
Thank you. Thank you, all 3 of you, for such wonderful presentations and insights. So my name's Jennifer Larby. I work for Christian Aid. I'm based in the UK. We focus a lot of our advocacy, speak up, we focus a lot of our advocacy and campaigning on debt justice in particular, and work with AfroDad as one of our key partners. We used to be in the tax justice advocacy space as well, but as people that work for INGOs know that we often spread ourselves too thin, but we are following the tax justice campaign very closely. And in our advocacy and campaigning, particularly to the UK government, we ensure that we are raising the issues around the UN Tax Convention in particular. But I did have a question about what we could be doing practically to push back against the UK government in particular, who we know don't play a particularly constructive role in many of these conversations about a UN debt workout mechanism or a UN tax convention. So any kind of practical advice, arguments, evidence that me and my colleagues could use back in the UK to the UK government to push back on the arguments that they would use to not support the UN Tax Convention and the Debt Convention. And I think this is really important, because a lot of the things that we are talking about at this conference does need to have kind of resonance in, you know, the capitals of the global north, where different organizations are, like Christian Aid and others, are really pushing the reparations and debt justice agenda. So just really would appreciate some thoughts and advice on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chennai Prof. and the whole panel for the very insightful presentation and the comments. I just want to hear from your analysis in terms of the current digital and technology drive, and in light of the crisis that we are talking about, and with my understanding of how Africa currently is lagging behind in terms of its digital and technological dividend. How can we look at this digital and technology dividend and try and prevent a crisis in the future? We see how data now is becoming the new gold, and something that can also entrench the challenges that we are talking about now. So I just want to hear your perspectives in terms of how can we prevent the possibility of having another crisis of digital and technology in the future, within the context of reparations as well, and also of these systemic and structural injustices that we are talking about. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Jason Braganza from Aphrodite. Let me begin by thanking Professor Bokpin and his team for putting together a very exciting paper. And as Chennai said, and Crystal as well, the reason, the motivation behind calling it the Black Paper, the important thing around it was, you know, to also bring different types of intersectional issues with regards to not just development finance, but the global economic governance structure. And as the paper continues to evolve, certainly is going to contribute to how we define in this global system that is slowly consuming itself and will very soon spit itself out in a very dangerous and disruptive way. So we hope that the Black Paper will find a position and a place on the continent to redefine our engagement in that. But I also want to appreciate what Eunice said about not trying to differentiate between climate financial architecture and the general global financial architecture. And I think these two things are very important, particularly as we try to bridge different struggles, different movements. We are witnessing in some instances a regression in some of the asks, particularly in those who are in the climate space, to things that were pushed back against nearly 20, 30 years ago. So certain things like conditionalities, things like debt-related financing instruments, things like, you know, lowering of tax regulations or creation of tax incentives to attract foreign direct investment into our continent with regards to accessing capital and finance for the climate finance or the energy transition. So the Black Paper also tries to sort of bring those two things, bring these different things together, and yes, definitely promote the idea that there is only one global financial architecture with different sort of buckets under there that we need to find a way of working together. So I just want to really commend Professor Bobkin for that, and continue, like Crystal and Chennai said, to encourage all of us to contribute feedback to this paper and embrace it as what is going to be another blueprint or an additional blueprint to what the continental agenda in the global architecture is going to look like. Thanks.
Sorry, that way. Sorry.
What? I hope you didn't take my time from that.
I did.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you very much. I mean, I must tell you that so far, what we've heard has really ignited a sort of a revolution within me, and I'm sure the delegates that have come here for the first time. Now, my question is about the Black Paper and the process. Where does it sit from here? What happens from here? Because it's almost like I've seen a lot, I've already prepared something that I will be tabling in Parliament in South Africa about what I heard yesterday. And I'd like to see the only way for these to become implementable and effective in the continent is if each country that's represented here becomes advocates in your country to go into the parliament there in that country and start these Black Papers within parliament there. So I asked the question, what is the status? And from the presentation that was made by the first person, I just forget the name, I think the impact of that, the insights that you've given us, has to be shared in every country in Africa. Because it's not a Ghanaian problem or a Zimbabwean problem. This is an African issue. And the only way we can tackle this effectively is if we use our own governments and our own parliaments in our different countries to advocate for what we've started here. And I don't know what the process is. I heard you say something like the paper is coming and we'll be invited. Is it like coming this afternoon, or is it coming tomorrow morning, or when? Because I want to go out and start protesting right now after what I've heard. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to close for that. There's a revolution starting there as a Kenyan. Come join, like we are about protest. So I will field the questions. I think the first question on what practical advice we have for folks in the UK and their governments, I think that can go to Chennai. Prof, I think the second question on the digital space and what that looks like can go to you. Jason, you spoke about intersectionality, which feminists have been doing for a long time. And Eunice, if you have anything to respond to that, I think it's an important conversation to have. All oppression is linked, and I think that has to be held central. With regards to the Black Paper, like we said, this is the first draft. Knowledge takes time. We're happy that the revolution flames are beginning. But knowledge takes time. So this is the first draft. We are reviewing it with a number of reviewers, making sure that it also has deep feminist roots in its intersectionality, its analysis, and its positions of the way forward. So it will take a few more months to do if we're going to do it well. But Jason, as Jason said, we invite you all, and if you are interested, please let us know, and we'll invite you to how a peer review mechanism or a review mechanism or conversations can take place. I also invite you to join APNIFT and set some flames there, the African Parliamentarians Network on Tax and Illicit Financial Flows. Chennai, who's here, can tell you more about it. There are the flames of parliamentarians working on questions, tax, debt, political economy, and I think it might be a good community for you to join. And also set some flames. As a Kenyan, my parliament is letting me down. So I'll toss on to Prof. and then Chennai and Eunice. You can sit where you are, actually.
Right, thank you very much. On digitization, the gap is wide. The gap is wide. I'm not too sure whether Africa is even playing catch-up right now, but I think that there's great potential because the world increasingly is being digitized and all of that. And because we just don't have the enablers to start with and all of that. So at the global governance level, digitization, I'm not too sure Africa is well represented, but I believe that this is something that is worth taking up so that we don't allow decades down the line before we begin to talk about how Africa is losing and all of that. But one of the things that I've been privy to be involved quite recently is about how African culture and artifacts are being digitized, right? And we are losing control. So a lot of these things have been digitized, and actually the patent and all of that sit in the global north and all of that. So the hardcore bit artifact will be here, but the digital form will be out there, and they will be trading with it and all of that. So I think these are things that Africa must begin to play a key role in there. But I'm thinking that the way we can do it is to maybe negotiate from position of strength. We have to be one on this and have, I know at the African Union level, the digitization strategy and all of that, it comes down to implementation and the financing and also the timelines that we want to put in place. So there is some kind of work being done in that area. I'm not too sure where they've gotten to in that area, but I think we also need to mobilize CSOs in that space as well so that we begin to monitor that. Oftentimes, if we leave this to political actors alone, Africa doesn't get its fair share in terms of the discussion and how it is represented. So I agree with you. Thank you.
Can I go? Yes. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for that question, Jennifer, and for two reasons. One of the things that we've at times seen is civil society from richer countries wanting to come to Africa to do advocacy work, right? Specifically in the tax justice movement, when quite frankly, within this conversation of not just the global tax reform, but also, sort of the global financial architecture broadly, the countries that are pushing back against this, right, are the countries such as where you're from. So what we actually need is for civil society from the UK, from Western countries, to be doing that work within the countries where you are, right? Rather than coming to do capacity building with our members of parliament, etc., right? So for me, that's the first point, and thank you for raising that. And then what I would say in terms of strategy, quite frankly, you just need to keep your foot on their neck, right? It's the persistence that I think is hopefully going to get us where we need to be, calling out their hypocrisy, because the United Kingdom and its overseas dependent territories are the most responsible for the loss of resources that are flooding, that are leaving the global south. So I would say that consistently calling out, consistently collectively working together to put pressure on members of parliament, to put pressure on policymakers, I think I would say that that's the most important thing. And then maybe just very quickly, I want to echo, I think, the point that was made by the Member of Parliament from South Africa. There absolutely is a need for us to domesticate the conversations that are happening in this room. And one of the reasons for that is, whilst I talk about this great work that's happening, that's being championed by the Africa Group, when you start to get into the detail, right, we have a few countries, South Africa being one of them, that's not always at the table, right, and sort of always fully behind what the entire Africa Group is saying. And so even domestically, we need to call them to account, right, to make sure that ultimately what they're also championing at the global level aligns, right, with the collective movement of the continent. So just to say, I think in terms of the black paper, that is absolutely a process we'd love for you to join, but it's important, right, that we also be doing this work at the national level.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you, Jason, for your comment. Very important thing. And I think he said it all, but the thing I would like to add to that is he mentioned the conditionalities and certain things that are being moved away from in other settings that are still happening in climate finance. And a huge example of that is when certain funds or climate finance mechanisms are set aside to specifically help African countries and then countries apply, and then they don't have the technical expertise that qualifies them to receive the funds that is supposedly set to come to that continent. And then there are several bureaucratic structures that make it virtually impossible for these countries to access these funds. And when the funds are coming in, you're also being told what to do with the money. And sometimes those priorities or the priorities of those funds do not align with what the continent needs. Only about 28% of climate finance came towards adaptation, which is Africa's primary need, because some of the damages that have been caused by climate finance cannot be fixed at this point. But a significant portion of climate finance is going to mitigation, which again would benefit these countries who will come in here and invest in renewable energy. And again, the money is going out. So thank you, Jason, for that comment. These are some of the issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. Bureaucratic violence, I think that's a paper in and of itself. Eunice, thank you. Chennai, thank you. Prof, thank you so much. We will put out as we go updates on the black paper. Thank you so much for coming so early. We're now a full room. The team behind the drafting of the black paper, this has been immensely, immensely amazing of a session. Thank you so much. Over to the main moderator.
I believe that clap was for me. Shall we now clap for the moderator? And, you know, being a moderator is the only time you get the privilege to have people that are way above you in terms of so many things to be your assistants. So, Crystal, great job. Good conversation, insights shared, and we appreciate. So, ladies and gentlemen, as announced, we will be going for breakout sessions. And yesterday, I had encouraged all of us to be able to scan the QR codes that were distributed to us, to be able to have access to the revised programs, the program rather, and any other related updates that would be given. The links were also provided on the WhatsApp group. So those of you that are on the group will be able to access them. Those of you that are not on the group, you can see some of our people by the door that will help you with that. And I'll call Jason to come through and make an announcement before we disperse to our various breakout sessions, please. And for the materials, just an emphasis again, please. Make sure your email addresses are written correctly. We know some of you, your handwriting may be like mine, which looks like Chinese. So make sure we can see correctly so that we send you and email you the materials.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, once again. Just very, very quickly. There will be side sessions throughout this floor, this part of the conference room. This particular room will have a slight slip of about 15 minutes in the sessions, but we built that in today. So we're not finishing at 7, for those of you who did very well and stood with us yesterday. So we did build it in to the program today. So your lunch break and everything will be still on time. So that's just for this room. There are other side sessions that have already started in other rooms behind us. The second one is the debt rally that the AFCOT 5, together with the Stop the Bleeding campaign and Ideas, as well as ITUC Africa, putting together tomorrow. There are materials and placards and all these very nice things that are being brought to the hotel and will be distributed throughout the course of today. If you do have your program, the route is mapped out in the program in terms of how many kilometers it's going to be and the different parts that we're going to walk through. As I mentioned yesterday, the march will pass just outside the hotel. For those who don't want to start at 7 a.m., you can join it en route as we get to the Independence Square later on today. So just those two announcements with regards to the room and the march tomorrow. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So make sure you prepare those trainers for the walk. And We'll see you later on.